I didn't show up for an inheritance. I showed up because he was my grandfather. The rest came later. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in September. The funeral was 5 days later. My Uncle Richard sat in the first row with his family and a photographer he'd hired for the family archive. I sat in the third row. Alone. No one acknowledged me during the service. No one asked how I was holding up. No one mentioned that I'd been the one visiting grandfather every Sunday for 8 years while they were too busy for him. They'd forgotten about me a long time ago, until the will was read and everything changed. This is that story. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in September. I got the call from the hospice nurse at 6:47 a.m. She was kind, professional. She told me Thomas had passed peacefully in his sleep and that he'd asked for me in his final hours. I wasn't surprised. I'd been the only one visiting. The funeral was held 5 days later at St. Catherine's, a small church Thomas had attended for 40 years, but that his family had long since abandoned for bigger, more impressive congregations. I sat in the third row. Richard, my uncle, Thomas's surviving son, sat in the first row with his wife Mary Ann, their children Sam and Amy, and a collection of people I'd never met but who looked appropriately mournful for the cameras. Yes, cameras. Because Richard had hired a photographer to document the funeral. For the family archive, he'd said when I asked. What he meant was, to prove we were here. No one acknowledged me during the service. No one asked how I was holding up. No one mentioned that I'd been the one sitting with Thomas every Sunday for the last 8 years while they were too busy with charity galas and country club brunches. I didn't expect them to. They'd forgotten about me a long time ago. My name is Kristen, and I've been invisible to my father's family since I was 11 years old. That was the year my father, Donald, Thomas's younger son, died in a car accident. One moment, I had a family. The next, I was an orphan being raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a grandfather who was grieving the loss of his favorite son. Richard stepped in immediately, not to help, to manage. He took over Thomas's business affairs. He moved into the position Donald would have held. He made sure everyone knew he was now the heir, the successor, the one who mattered. And I became the reminder of what was lost. The fatherless girl, the inconvenient grandchild, the one they didn't know what to do with. At first, they invited me to family gatherings, Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthday parties for Sam and Amy. But I didn't fit. I wore clothes from Target while they wore designer labels. I talked about school projects while they talked about private tutors and summer homes. I existed in a world they'd left behind. So eventually, the invitations stopped coming, and I stopped being part of the family, except for Thomas. He never forgot. Every Sunday, I visited my grandfather. I started when I was 16, old enough to take the bus across town to the assisted living facility where he'd moved after a stroke made living alone impossible. Richard had chosen the facility. It was expensive, well rated. The kind of place you put a parent when you want to feel like you're doing the right thing without actually having to be involved. Richard visited twice a year, Christmas and Thomas's birthday. Mary Ann came once, the day they moved him in. Sam and Amy never came at all, but I came every Sunday. I'd sit with Thomas in his small room overlooking the garden. We'd talk about everything and nothing. He'd tell me stories about building his business from scratch in the 1960s, about meeting my grandmother, about Donald as a boy. He'd ask about my life, my job, my dreams. He remembered everything, and he never once made me feel forgotten. When Thomas's health declined, I was the one the facility called. When he needed someone to sign paperwork, I was the emergency contact. When he was moved to hospice, I was the one who sat beside him. And when he died, I was the one who knew his favorite hymn, his favorite scripture, the stories he wanted told. But at the funeral, Richard gave the eulogy. He talked about Thomas as a titan of industry, a pillar of the community, a man who built an empire. He didn't mention that Thomas died alone except for a granddaughter nobody remembered. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I almost didn't go. The lawyer, Janet Morrison, had called and said my presence was requested, but I assumed it was a formality. A small bequest, maybe a piece of jewelry. Something sentimental that wouldn't matter to anyone else. I certainly didn't expect anything significant. Thomas had money. A lot of it. The business he'd built was worth millions. The investments he'd made over 60 years had compounded into generational wealth. That money would go to Richard. Everyone knew that. Richard had been running the business for 20 years. He'd stepped into Donald's shoes and never looked back. He'd earned it in his mind. And in the family's mind. I was just the granddaughter who visited on Sundays. I didn't expect anything, but I went anyway, because Thomas had asked for me, and I never said no to Thomas. The reading was held at Morrison and Associates, a law firm in a downtown building with marble floors and too much air conditioning. I arrived 10 minutes early. Richard, Mary Ann, Sam, and Amy were already there, seated in the conference room like they owned it. Richard wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Mary Ann wore pearls and an expression that suggested she was already mentally redecorating Thomas's house. Sam was on his phone. Amy was filing her nails. They looked up when I walked in. "Oh," Mary Ann said. "Kristen, I didn't realize you'd be here." "Janet called me," I said simply. "Of course she did," Richard said, his tone suggesting this was somehow an imposition. "You were close to Dad. I'm sure he left you something. A keepsake." He smiled. It wasn't kind. I sat down at the far end of the table. No one spoke to me. They spoke around me. Richard and Mary Ann discussed vacation plans. Sam complained about his job. Amy talked about a wedding she was planning to attend. I sat quietly and waited. Janet Morrison entered at exactly 2 p.m. She was in her 60s, gray-haired, sharp-eyed. She carried a leather folder and a gravity that silenced the room immediately. "Thank you all for coming," she said, taking her seat at the head of the table. "We're here to execute the last will and testament of Thomas Edward Morrison, dated March 14th, 2024. March. 6 months ago. I remembered that day. Thomas had seemed lighter somehow, like he'd made a decision that brought him peace. Janet opened the folder. "Thomas was very clear about his wishes," she said, "and he asked that I read this letter aloud before distributing the assets." She pulled out a single sheet of paper, handwritten, and she began to read. "To my family, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. And I hope you'll forgive an old man for using his final words to tell you some hard truths. I built a business. I made money. I provided for my family. And somewhere along the way, I confused wealth with love. I thought that if I gave you financial security, I was giving you everything you needed. But I was wrong. Because the only person who showed up when I needed love, not money, not status, not inheritance, was Kristen. She visited me every Sunday for 8 years. She sat with me when I couldn't remember her name. She held my hand when I was dying. She remembered my favorite hymn, and not once did she ask me for anything. Richard, you are my son, and I love you, but you stopped seeing me as your father the day Donald died. You saw me as a business, an asset, a legacy to manage. You visited twice a year, and every time you talked about projections and portfolios. You never asked how I was. So I'm leaving you the business. You've run it for 20 years. It's yours. But that's all you get. The house, the investments, the savings, the things that matter. Those go to Kristen. Not because she asked for them, but because she loved me when I had nothing left to give but time. If you're angry, I understand. But ask yourself this. When was the last time you sat with someone who couldn't give you anything in return? Kristen did that every Sunday. That's love. That's family. Thomas. Janet set the letter down. The room was completely silent. Richard's face had gone from pink to white to red. Mary Ann's mouth was open. Sam had finally looked up from his phone. Amy had stopped filing her nails, and I sat perfectly still, tears streaming down my face, because Thomas had seen me, even when everyone else forgot. He remembered. Janet continued in her professional voice. The business, including all associated assets and shares, goes to Richard Morrison, as stated. Richard exhaled. The house on Lakeview Drive, the investment portfolio, the savings accounts, and all personal property go to Kristen Morrison. She slid a folder across the table. I opened it with shaking hands. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Then they did. $4.7 million. In investments, savings, and property. I looked up. Janet was watching me with something that might have been approval. Richard stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "This is insane," he said. "Dad wasn't in his right mind. He was sick. This will can be contested." Thomas was evaluated by two independent physicians in March. Janet interrupted calmly. Both certified he was of sound mind. Both reports are filed with this will. You're welcome to contest, but you'll lose. Richard looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. "You planned this," he said. I shook my head slowly. "I visited him. That's all I did." "You manipulated him." "I loved him," I said quietly. And that was the truth. Richard and his family left without another word. I stayed. Janet handed me keys to the house, paperwork for the accounts, contact information for the financial advisor Thomas had trusted. "He talked about you often," she said. "Every time we updated the will, he'd mention the girl who visited on Sundays. He was very proud of you." I couldn't speak. She squeezed my hand once, and then she left. I sat alone in that conference room for a long time. I didn't keep the house. It was beautiful, 4 bedrooms, a lake view, gardens Thomas had loved, but it wasn't mine. I sold it and donated half the proceeds to the hospice facility that cared for Thomas in his final weeks. The other half went into a trust for my future children. If I have them, the investments I kept. Not because I needed the money, but because Thomas had built them carefully over a lifetime, and I wanted to honor that. I used the interest to fund scholarships for kids like me, kids who lost a parent young and need help getting through college. I named it the Donald Morrison Memorial Scholarship, after my father, because Thomas never forgot him either. Richard never spoke to me again. Mary Ann sent a lawyer's letter once, trying to challenge the will. It went nowhere. Sam sent a Facebook message 2 years later asking if I'd loan him money for a business opportunity. I didn't respond. Amy got married. I wasn't invited, and I'm okay with that because I didn't visit Thomas for 8 years hoping for an inheritance. I visited because he was my grandfather, and because I knew what it felt like to be forgotten. I never wanted him to feel that way. The fact that he remembered me, that he saw me, even when no one else did, that's worth more than any amount of money, but the money helps. It helps me remember that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make, every single Sunday. That is the story of They Forgot About Me Until the Will Was Read. If you are still with me, subscribe to my Story Vault for stories that only reveal their power at the end.